Did people in the Middle Ages really argue about the existence of God using logic? Could a single book change how an entire continent thought about everything from the soul to the universe? And what happens when the smartest minds of an era clash over the very nature of truth, from the 11th to the 15th centuries? Number 9. William of Ockham. Imagine a world where everything you learned, every idea you held about how reality worked, suddenly faced a giant challenge that was the world William of Ockham lived in. Born in England in the late 1200s, this Franciscan friar was a sharp, independent thinker who turned many traditional ideas of his time upside down. He earned himself a reputation as a fierce debater and a radical philosopher, which sometimes got him into trouble with the church. He spent years under house arrest and eventually fled to Germany, remaining under the protection of the Holy Roman Emperor Louis IV as political tensions flared between the emperor and the pope. Ockham's biggest battlefield was the nature of universals. This was a huge question for medieval thinkers. Do things like humanness or redness exist as real things out there in the world, separate from individual humans or red objects? Some argued they did in a powerful abstract sense. Others said they were just names we give to groups of similar things. Ockham jumped into this debate with both feet, pushing what became known as nominalism. For Ockham, a universal like humanity was not a distinct, existing thing outside of individual humans. It was merely a concept or a name that our minds use to group similar individuals together. There are individual humans, Ockham insisted, but no separate humanity floating around. This sounds simple, but it had massive implications for philosophy and theology, questioning deeply held metaphysical assumptions. To understand Ockham's mindset, you need to know about Occam's razor. This isn't a physical razor, but a principle. It states that plurality must not be posited without necessity. In simpler terms, when you have competing explanations for something, the simplest one that works is usually the best. Don't multiply entities unnecessarily. Ockham applied this razor to just about everything. He used it to trim away complex theories that proposed extra layers of reality or unnecessary distinctions. For example, if you could explain how knowledge worked by just referring to individual things and mental concepts, why invent abstract universals as separate existing entities? This principle wasn't just a philosophical preference for Ockham. It was a powerful tool for analyzing arguments and identifying what he saw as intellectual clutter. His ideas also touched on the nature of God's power. Many scholastics tried to understand God's actions through divine intellect, suggesting God's will was bound by his own wisdom and goodness. Ockham, however, leaned towards what's called voluntarism. He emphasized God's absolute freedom and omnipotence. For Ockham, God's will was primary. God is good not because he wills what is inherently good, but because whatever God wills becomes good by virtue of his willing it. This meant God could theoretically have chosen to command something entirely different, and it would still be good because it was his command. This gave God an almost terrifying freedom from any limitations, even those of inherent rationality or natural law that some other thinkers proposed. Ockham also contributed significantly to logic. He meticulously analyzed propositions, terms, and arguments, making distinctions that were incredibly precise. His work on supposition theory, how terms refer to things in different contexts, was a major development in medieval logic. He wasn't just interested in abstract ideas. He wanted to understand how language worked and how we could use it more accurately to grasp reality. His emphasis on direct experience and logical analysis marked a shift in thinking. He suggested that our knowledge of the world comes primarily from direct experience of individual things, not from abstract reasoning about universals. This laid some groundwork for later empirical thought. Even centuries later, the impact of William of Ockham was immediate and profound. His nominalism challenged the very foundation of much of the scholastic philosophy that had come before him. Debates raged between Ockhamists and followers of other schools, particularly those who believed in a stronger reality for universals. His razor encouraged a more streamlined and skeptical approach to philosophical and theological problems, questioning assumptions that had been taken for granted for centuries. His separation of faith and reason became sharper than for many of his predecessors. While he remained a devoted theologian, he often argued that many theological truths, like the existence of God or the immortality of the soul, could not be definitively proven by human reason alone, but had to be accepted through faith. This pushed the boundaries of what reason could achieve and what belonged to revelation, creating new intellectual pathways for future generations. Number 8. John Duns Scotus. Imagine a thinker so sharp, so precise in his arguments, that he earned the nickname the Subtle Doctor. That was John Duns Scotus, a Scottish Franciscan friar who lived in the late 1200s. Scotus was a brilliant logician and theologian who developed a complex system of thought that challenged and often rivaled the dominant philosophical ideas of his time. He was known for making incredibly fine distinctions in his arguments, sometimes leading to accusations of being overly complex, but always with a purpose: to get to the absolute truth of a matter. Scotus was deeply concerned with the nature of being itself. He introduced the idea of the univocity of being. This sounds complicated, but it means that the concept of being is understood in the same way, whether we're talking about God or a created thing like a human or a stone. While God's being is infinite and perfect, and a creature's being is finite and imperfect, the fundamental concept of being applies to both in the same way. This was a radical departure from many thinkers who argued for an analogical understanding of being, where the term being meant something fundamentally different when applied to God versus creation. Scotus believed that understanding being univocally allowed for a more direct and certain way to reason about God from creation, and to bridge the gap between divine and created reality in our minds. Another of Scotus's groundbreaking ideas was haecceity. This word, meaning thisness, was his answer to the ancient problem of individuation. How is one individual human different from another, even if they share the exact same human nature? What makes this particular human distinct from that particular human? Scotus argued that beyond all the common qualities, like being human, having a certain shape, etc., each individual possesses a unique, unrepeatable, positive characteristic that makes it this specific thing and no other. This haecceity is what makes something an individual. It's not a form or a matter, but an ultimate difference that is unique to each distinct entity. This was a major contribution to metaphysics, providing a detailed explanation for why distinct individuals exist within the same species. Like Ockham, Scotus also emphasized voluntarism, the idea that God's will is primary, but Scotus's voluntarism was different from Ockham's. For Scotus, God's will was absolutely free and not bound by any necessity, even his own intellect. God chooses what is good, and it is good because he chooses it, not because it is inherently good prior to his choice. This gave God an incredible freedom and majesty. It also meant that morality, for humans, ultimately stemmed from God's commands. While God's intellect certainly informs his will, the will has a certain priority. This contrasted with thinkers like Aquinas, who emphasized God's intellect as primary, with his will flowing from his wisdom and goodness. Scotus also held a unique theological position on the Incarnation, arguing for the primacy of Christ. He believed that God would have become human in Christ even if humanity had never fallen into sin. For Scotus, the Incarnation was not just a divine plan for redemption, but the ultimate fulfillment of creation, the pinnacle of God's perfect plan to unite all things in Christ. This elevated Christ to an even more central role in the divine economy and creation itself, emphasizing the beauty and ultimate purpose of God's design. His method involved incredibly rigorous logical analysis, often using highly technical language and complex distinctions. He would dissect arguments with surgical precision, revealing hidden assumptions or flaws. His writings are dense and challenging, reflecting his deep intellectual engagement with every problem. He often engaged in lengthy systematic disputations, a key part of the scholastic method, where he would argue for a position, raise objections, and then respond to those objections with detailed reasoning. The impact of John Duns Scotus was immense. His ideas quickly formed a rival school of thought to that of Thomas Aquinas. Scotists and Thomists debated for centuries, each group developing and defending their master's ideas. Scotus's emphasis on God's will and the freedom of creatures, his unique approach to individuation, and his subtle distinctions pushed philosophical and theological inquiry into new depths. His work fostered a spirit of intellectual independence and a willingness to question established norms, even those from highly respected authorities. His legacy continues to influence philosophical thought on individuation, free will, and the nature of being, proving that subtlety can indeed define an era. Number 7. Siger of Brabant. Imagine a scholar whose ideas were so daring, so revolutionary for his time, that they sparked major controversies and even led to condemnations. That was Siger of Brabant, a philosopher active in the mid to late 1200s, primarily at the University of Paris. Siger represents a fascinating and at times frightening extreme of what happens when medieval thinkers fully embrace the newly rediscovered philosophical ideas of Aristotle, interpreted through the lens of Islamic commentators like Averroes. Siger was a leading figure in what became known as Latin Averroism. Averroes, a 12th century Islamic philosopher, had written extensive commentaries on Aristotle's works. These commentaries were hugely influential in the Latin West, but Averroes' interpretations often contradicted fundamental Christian doctrines. Siger, along with other Averroists, seemed willing to follow Aristotle's philosophical arguments to their logical conclusions, even when those conclusions clashed with Christian theology. This created immense tension and forced scholars to confront the thorny relationship between faith and reason in a new way. One of Sigur's most controversial ideas concerned the human intellect. Following Averroes, Siger argued for the unity of the intellect. This meant that there was only one single universal intellect, shared by all human beings. Individual humans might participate in this intellect, but their own individual souls did not possess a separate, unique intellect that was immortal and distinct. This idea directly contradicted the Christian belief in the individual, immortal human soul. If all humans shared one intellect, then personal accountability, individual salvation, and the resurrection of the body became deeply problematic concepts. This position naturally drew heavy fire from theologians, who saw it as undermining core Christian beliefs. Another challenging concept, championed by Siger, was the eternity of the world. Aristotle had argued that the world had no beginning and no end. While many Christian thinkers found ways to interpret Aristotle in a manner consistent with creation, ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, Siger seemed to accept Aristotle's view of an eternal world. This was in direct opposition to the Christian doctrine that God created the world in time, a specific act of creation. Siger argued that philosophical reasoning led to the conclusion of an eternal world, regardless of what religious revelation stated. Sigur's approach often led to accusations of holding a double truth theory. This meant that something could be true according to philosophy but false according to theology, or vice versa, and both could somehow be held simultaneously. While Siger probably didn't believe in a literal double truth, in the sense that both contradictory statements could be simultaneously true in reality, he argued that philosophical reasoning operating on its own principles, could arrive at conclusions that differed from those of faith. He maintained that philosophy was an independent discipline, and its conclusions should be respected even if they caused theological discomfort. He would often say, "I reason according to Aristotle, but I believe as a Christian," which only heightened the tensions. His bold assertions and his willingness to pursue philosophical arguments wherever they led, even if they were deemed dangerous, put him in direct conflict with prominent theologians of his day, most notably Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas actively wrote against the Averroists, meticulously refuting their arguments and showing how Aristotle could be interpreted in a way that harmonized with Christian doctrine without sacrificing reason. The debates between the Thomists and the Averroists, like Siger, were some of the fiercest intellectual battles of the 13th century. Controversies surrounding Sigur's ideas ultimately led to condemnations by the Church. In 1270 and again in 1277, the Bishop of Paris, Étienne Tempier, issued lists of condemned propositions, many of which directly targeted the ideas held by Siger and other Latin Averroists, such as the unity of the intellect and the eternity of the world. These condemnations aimed to curb what was seen as the dangerous influence of radical Aristotelianism on Christian theology. Siger himself was summoned before the Inquisition and eventually died in Orvieto, Italy, possibly at the hands of his own cleric. Despite his eventual condemnation, Siger of Brabant had a lasting impact. He represented the intellectual challenge posed by the full encounter with Aristotle's philosophy. His work forced Christian thinkers to engage deeply with the implications of philosophical reasoning and to define more clearly the boundaries and relationship between faith and reason. He showed that the scholastic project of integrating philosophy and theology was not always a smooth process and could lead to profound intellectual and theological crises, proving that even controversy could define an era. Number 6. Bonaventure. Imagine a journey, not across lands, but within the mind and soul, leading directly to God. That was the vision of Bonaventure, an Italian Franciscan, friar, theologian, and philosopher who lived in the 13th century. Born Giovanni di Fidanza, he later became known as Bonaventure and was one of the most influential figures of his time, often called the Seraphic Doctor because of his profound spiritual insight and passionate devotion. While his contemporary Thomas Aquinas was busy integrating Aristotle, Bonaventure offered a powerful alternative deeply rooted in the Augustinian tradition. Bonaventure was concerned with more than just intellectual understanding. He sought wisdom that led to spiritual transformation and union with God. His most famous work, The Journey of the Mind into God, Itinerarium Mentis in Deum, outlines a path of spiritual ascent. It's not a dry philosophical treatise, but a guide to contemplation. He describes a 6-stage journey, starting from the external world and moving inward, then upward, towards the divine. The stages progress from observing God's presence in creation, the world as vestiges or traces of God, to seeing God in the senses and imagination, then within the powers of the soul itself, and finally beyond the intellect to a mystical encounter with God through love and ecstasy. For Bonaventure, all creation speaks of God. The natural world is like a book filled with signatures and exemplars of the divine. Every creature, from a tiny insect to a vast galaxy, reflects some aspect of its creator. Studying nature wasn't just about scientific knowledge. It was about finding pathways to God. This view was deeply Augustinian, emphasizing the illumination of the mind by divine light. Truth, for Bonaventure, wasn't just discovered by human reason alone, but also revealed by God. The human intellect, he believed, needed divine illumination to fully grasp truth, especially spiritual truths. Bonaventure held a different view of the relationship between faith and reason than some of his contemporaries. While he valued reason, he saw it as subservient to faith, like a handmaiden. Philosophy for him was useful, but primarily as a tool for understanding and defending theological truths. It was not an independent pursuit that could arrive at ultimate truth on its own. He was cautious about the full integration of Aristotle's philosophy, especially parts that seemed to contradict Christian revelation or overly emphasize reason at the expense of faith and contemplation. He believed that some parts of Aristotle's thought, particularly those concerning the eternity of the world or the nature of God, could mislead one if not properly guided by revelation. His work is characterized by a strong emphasis on love and the affections, not just intellectual assent. For Bonaventure, knowing God was not just about intellectual concepts. It was about loving God and desiring union with Him. He believed that the ultimate goal of human existence was to return to God, the source of all being and goodness. This return happens through a combination of faith, disciplined intellect, and a heart inflamed with divine love. He saw the incarnation of Christ as the central event of history, the ultimate manifestation of God's love, and the means by which humanity could undertake its journey back to God. Bonaventure also played a crucial role in shaping the Franciscan order. As Minister General, he unified the order, guiding it back to its original ideals of poverty and spiritual devotion after a period of internal strife. His leadership solidified the Franciscan intellectual tradition, ensuring it maintained its distinct Augustinian and mystical character even as other orders like the Dominicans embraced more Aristotelian approaches. His teachings provided a strong spiritual foundation for the order, influencing generations of Franciscan scholars and mystics. The impact of Bonaventure was profound, offering a powerful alternative to the growing scholastic emphasis on pure reason and Aristotelian metaphysics. He reminded scholars that the ultimate purpose of intellectual inquiry was not just knowledge for its own sake, but wisdom that leads to God. His work provided a rich theological and mystical framework that continued to resonate particularly within the Franciscan tradition and kept alive the deeply spiritual and Augustinian currents of scholasticism. He showed that the pursuit of truth could be a deeply personal, contemplative, and bourgeois journey, proving that spiritual insight could indeed define an era. Number 5. Thomas Aquinas. Imagine a mind so powerful, so systematic, that it could weave together centuries of philosophical thought with Christian theology into a single comprehensive tapestry. That was Thomas Aquinas, an Italian Dominican friar who lived in the 13th century. Born into a noble family, he famously defied his parents' wishes to become a Dominican, an order dedicated to study and preaching. He became one of the most influential thinkers in Western history, earning titles like the Angelic Doctor and the Universal Doctor. Aquinas' major project was nothing less than a grand synthesis of faith and reason. When he arrived on the intellectual scene, the philosophical works of Aristotle, largely lost to the West for centuries, were being rediscovered through Arabic and Jewish scholars. Aristotle's logical, empirical approach to the world challenged many traditional Christian assumptions based on Augustine and Plato. Many scholars struggled with how to reconcile this new pagan philosophy with Christian revelation. Some rejected Aristotle entirely, while others like Siger of Brabant embraced him so fully that they reached conclusions dangerous to Christian doctrine. Aquinas, however, saw a different path. He believed that truth, whether revealed by God or discovered by human reason, ultimately came from the same source and could not contradict itself. His monumental work, the Summa Theologiae, Sum of Theology, is a testament to his systematic genius. It is not just a book, but an entire intellectual universe. In it, Aquinas tackled almost every major question in theology and philosophy: the existence of God, the nature of the soul, ethics, law, the sacraments, and the divine attributes. He organized the Summa into articles, each posing a specific question, e.g., whether God exists. He would then list objections against his position, present his own argument, and then meticulously responds to each objection. This question-and-answer method became the hallmark of high scholasticism, demonstrating a rigorous, logical approach to theological problems. Perhaps his most famous contributions are his 5 ways to demonstrate God's existence. Unlike Anselm's ontological argument, which started from a concept of God, Aquinas' 5 ways began with observations about the natural world. For motion, everything in motion was put in motion by something else. This chain cannot go on infinitely, so there must be a first mover unmoved, which is God. From efficient cause, every effect has a cause. Again, this chain of causes cannot go on infinitely, so there must be a first cause, uncaused, which is God. From contingency, things exist that are contingent. They don't have to exist. They can come into being and pass away. Not everything can be contingent, or at some point nothing would exist. Therefore, there must be a necessary being, which is God. From degrees of perfection, we observe varying degrees of goodness, truth, and nobility in things. These degrees imply a maximum, a perfect being that is the cause of all perfections, which is God. From teleology, order of the universe, natural things, even those without intelligence, act for an end or purpose. This orderly behavior points to an intelligent designer who directs them, which is God. These arguments, while not proofs in the modern scientific sense, were logical deductions based on common observations and Aristotelian metaphysics. Aquinas' philosophy of the human person emphasized the soul as the form of the body, a single substance composed of matter, body, and form, soul. This differed from the Platonic Augustinian view, which saw the soul as distinct and merely inhabiting the body. For Aquinas, the soul was naturally suited to the body, and together they constituted the human person. He also developed a sophisticated theory of natural law, arguing that humans can discover moral principles through reason by reflecting on their own nature and the order of the world. This natural law, he believed, was a participation in God's eternal law. His method involved careful distinction. He distinguished between truths accessible by reason, like the existence of God, some moral principles, and truths accessible only by faith, like the Trinity, the Incarnation. He believed that reason could prepare the way for faith and illuminate its truths, but it could not fully grasp the mysteries of revelation. He sought to show that there was no real conflict between true philosophy and true theology, only a misunderstanding or a flawed argument. The impact of Thomas Aquinas was enormous and enduring. His Summa Theologiae became a foundational text for Catholic theology and philosophy. His comprehensive system provided a coherent framework for understanding the world, humanity, and God. He succeeded in integrating Aristotle's philosophy into Christian thought in a way that preserved both philosophical rigor and theological orthodoxy. His ideas were not immediately accepted without debate. In fact, some of his propositions were initially condemned in Paris and Oxford alongside those of the Averroists. However, his work gradually gained prominence, especially within the Dominican order, and eventually became the dominant intellectual current within the Catholic Church, solidifying the intellectual landscape for centuries and truly defining an era. Number 4. Albertus Magnus. Imagine a scholar so incredibly learned that his contemporaries called him Magnus the Great, even during his lifetime. That was Albertus Magnus, a German Dominican friar, philosopher, and theologian who lived in the 13th century. He was a giant of intellect, a polymath who made significant contributions not just to theology and philosophy, but also to natural sciences like botany, zoology, and even alchemy. He was also the revered teacher of Thomas Aquinas, paving the way for his most famous student's monumental achievements. Albertus Magnus's most significant contribution was his pioneering work in bringing the full scope of Aristotle's writings into the Latin West and systematically integrating them into Christian thought. Before Albert, many of Aristotle's works on natural philosophy, his writings on physics, biology, meteorology, psychology, were largely unknown or misunderstood in Europe. Albertus took on the daunting task of translating, commenting on, and explaining almost the entire Aristotelian corpus. He didn't just translate, he paraphrased, clarified, and contextualized, making these complex pagan texts accessible to a Christian audience. He believed that understanding the natural world, as Aristotle did, could deepen one's understanding of God, the ultimate creator. What set Albert apart was his insistence on observation and empirical study, especially in natural science. While much of medieval learning relied on authoritative texts and logical deduction, Albert encouraged direct experience of the world. He engaged in extensive first-hand study of plants, animals, and minerals. His works include detailed descriptions of flora and fauna, demonstrating a keen eye for observation that was rare for his time. For example, in his botanical writings he detailed thousands of plant species, many based on his personal observations, rather than just ancient texts. He also experimented with chemicals and explored astronomical phenomena. This empirical spirit distinguished him and showed a different facet of scholastic inquiry. Albert articulated a clear distinction between natural science and theology. He recognized that different disciplines had different methods and different subject matters. Natural science, he argued, dealt with the world of sensible things, using reason and experience to understand their causes and effects. Theology, on the other hand, dealt with divine revelation, mysteries that could only be known through faith. While these two realms were distinct, they were not contradictory. He believed that a deeper understanding of the natural world through philosophical and scientific inquiry could actually lead to a greater appreciation of God's wisdom and power in creation. This careful separation allowed him to fully embrace Aristotle's natural philosophy without feeling it threatened Christian doctrine. He wrote voluminously, producing encyclopedic works that covered logic, metaphysics, ethics, psychology, and a vast range of natural sciences. His commentaries on Aristotle were not mere summaries. They often included his own original insights, critiques, and expansions. He also engaged with Arabic and Jewish philosophical traditions, drawing on their insights to enrich Christian thought. His philosophical contributions laid much of the groundwork for later scholastic developments, particularly in epistemology and metaphysics. He debated the nature of universals, the relationship between essence and existence, and the powers of the human soul. Albertus Magnus's impact cannot be overstated. He, single-handedly, brought a vast new body of knowledge into the intellectual mainstream of the West. By systemizing Aristotle's natural philosophy, he provided a rich philosophical vocabulary and conceptual framework that later thinkers, especially his student Thomas Aquinas, would use to build their grand theological syntheses. Without Albert's monumental effort to assimilate and explain Aristotle, the intellectual landscape of the 13th century would have been vastly different. He showed that it was possible to pursue scientific inquiry and philosophical reasoning with rigor while remaining a devout Christian, and that both paths could lead to a deeper understanding of truth, proving that universal knowledge could indeed define an era. Number 3. Peter Lombard. Imagine a world where theological education was a scattered mess of disparate opinions and texts. Then, imagine a single book arriving that brought order to the chaos, becoming the standard textbook for centuries of students and scholars. That book was the Sentences by Peter Lombard, a French theologian and Bishop of Paris who lived in the 12th century. While he may not be as famous for original philosophical arguments as some others on this list, his contribution to the method and structure of scholastic theology was revolutionary and utterly indispensable. Before Lombard, students of theology had to wade through countless individual works of the Church Fathers, trying to piece together a coherent understanding of Christian doctrine. There was no single organized curriculum. Peter Lombard set out to remedy this. His monumental work, the Requatur Sententiarum, 4 books of sentences, was a comprehensive compilation of authoritative statements, sententiae, from earlier Church Fathers, primarily Augustine, but also Ambrose, Jerome, and others. He organized these statements systematically, addressing virtually every major theological question. The sentences were divided into 4 books. Book 1 focused on God, His nature, attributes, the Trinity. Book the 2nd dealt with creation, angels, humanity, sin, and grace. The 3rd explored the incarnation of Christ, the virtues and the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Book the 4th covered the sacraments and the last things, death, judgment, heaven, hell. Lombard's genius wasn't just in gathering texts, it was in his organizational method. For each theological topic or question, he would present conflicting statements from different Church Fathers. For example, he might show 2 seemingly contradictory passages from Augustine on a particular point. He didn't always resolve these contradictions himself. Instead, he presented the arguments, often providing context or subtle distinctions, thereby challenging his readers and students to use their own reason and theological training to reconcile the differing views. This method encouraged critical thinking and dialectical engagement, which were central to the emerging scholastic approach. The sentences quickly became the standard textbook for theological faculties across Europe, from the 13th century well into the 16th century. To earn a degree in theology, every student was required to lecture on the sentences and write a commentary on them. This practice meant that some of the greatest minds of the medieval period, including Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure, John Duns Scotus, and William of Ockham, all began their theological careers by writing extensive commentaries on Lombard's work. These commentaries were not just summaries, they became platforms for these scholars to develop their own original ideas, debates, and philosophical systems. In a way, Lombard provided the common language and framework within which these intellectual giants conducted their most profound discussions. Lombard himself was not primarily an original philosopher, but a masterful compiler and organizer. His work represents a crucial step in the institutionalization of scholasticism. It provided a clear, structured curriculum for theological study, ensuring that all students were exposed to the same core doctrines and foundational texts. It facilitated systematic debate and allowed for the progressive development of theological ideas as later scholars built upon, challenged, and refined the discussions presented in the sentences. The sentences defined the very structure of theological education for centuries. They shaped the way questions were asked, arguments were formed, and doctrines were systematized. The sheer longevity and universal adoption of Lombard's work are a testament to its practical utility and intellectual power. He provided the scaffold upon which the towering intellectual structures of high scholasticism were built, proving that even organization and compilation could define an era. Number 2. Peter Abelard. Imagine a brilliant, magic, and fiercely independent thinker whose intellectual prowess could charm and challenge everyone around him, even as his personal life became the stuff of legend. That was Peter Abelard, a French philosopher, theologian, and logician who lived in the late 11th and early 12th centuries. His sharp mind and innovative methods made him one of the most influential and controversial figures of early scholasticism. Abelard was a master of dialectic, the art of logical debate and reasoning. He believed that vigorous questioning and the careful examination of opposing viewpoints were essential steps on the path to truth. He famously declared, "By doubting we are led to inquire, and by inquiry we perceive the truth." This wasn't doubt for the sake of skepticism, but doubt as a powerful tool for intellectual progress. He didn't just accept received wisdom, he wanted to understand it through rigorous logical analysis. His most famous work, Sic et Non, Yes and No, perfectly illustrates his method. In this book, Abelard presented 158 theological questions, followed by numerous quotes from the Church Fathers, like Augustine or Jerome, that seemed to offer contradictory answers. For example, on one page you might find quotes saying, "God can do all things," and on the next quotes suggesting there are some things God cannot do. Crucially, Abelard did not provide his own resolutions to these contradictions. Instead, he simply presented the conflicting authorities, challenging his students to use their reason, logical distinctions, and understanding of context to reconcile them. This method revolutionized medieval education, moving away from simple memorization towards active critical engagement with texts and ideas. Abelard also plunged into the heated debate about universals. Remember the question about whether humanness exists as a real thing or just a name. Abelard offered a nuanced position known as conceptualism. He argued that universals are not independent realities existing apart from individual things, as extreme realists claimed, nor are they mere sounds or names without any basis in reality, as extreme nominalists claim. Instead, universals are concepts or mental constructs that our minds form by abstracting common features from individual objects. They exist in the mind, but they are based on real similarities among things in the world. This position was a sophisticated attempt to bridge the gap between realism and nominalism, allowing for both intellectual understanding and the reality of individual existence. Beyond metaphysics, Abelard made significant contributions to ethics. He argued that the moral quality of an action depends not on the action itself, but on the intention of the person performing it. A seemingly good act done with an evil intention is sinful, and a seemingly bad act done with a good intention might not be. This emphasis on subjective intention was revolutionary and deeply influential in later moral philosophy. He also engaged in complex theological debates about the Trinity and the nature of grace. Abelard's intellectual journey was intertwined with his dramatic personal life, particularly his tragic love affair with his brilliant student, Eloise. This scandal and its brutal aftermath, Abelard was castrated and Heloise forced into a convent, overshadowed his later career and highlighted the dangers of challenging established norms. Despite facing condemnation for some of his theological views, from figures like Bernard of Clairvaux, Abelard's intellectual force was undeniable. The impact of Peter Abelard was immense. His Sic et Non method became a foundational text for the emerging scholastic style, fostering rigorous logical debate and the systematic analysis of authoritative texts. He established the importance of dialectic in theology and philosophy, showing that doubt could be a pathway to deeper understanding. His conceptualist solution to the problem of universals offered a powerful alternative that resonated with many later thinkers. Abelard's challenging spirit and insistence on reason's role in understanding truth opened new avenues for inquiry and debate, setting the stage for the flourishing of scholasticism in the centuries to come, proving that even scandal and innovation could define an era. Number 1. Anselm of Canterbury. Imagine a monk in the quiet confines of an abbey, wrestling with the most profound questions of existence, using nothing but pure reason. This was Anselm of Canterbury, an Italian Benedictine monk who lived in the late 11th and early 12th centuries, eventually rising to become the Archbishop of Canterbury in England. Often called the Father of Scholasticism, Anselm laid down fundamental principles that would guide intellectual inquiry for centuries, particularly his famous motto, faith-seeking understanding, fides quaerens intellectum. Anselm wasn't interested in proving God's existence to atheists, but rather in using reason to understand what he already believed by faith. He started with the conviction that God exists, and then sought to discover logical arguments that could demonstrate this truth in a compelling way. He believed that while faith came first, reason could illuminate and deepen one's understanding of that faith. This approach became a cornerstone of Scholasticism, which aimed to reconcile Christian revelation with rational inquiry. His most famous contribution is undoubtedly the ontological argument for the existence of God, presented in his short but profound work, Proslogion. This argument is revolutionary because it attempts to prove God's existence solely from the concept of God, without relying on observations of the world. Here's how it goes. Anselm defines God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Now, he reasons, if such a being exists only in our understanding, in our minds, and not in reality, then we could conceive of an even greater being, one that also exists in reality. But this creates a contradiction. If we can conceive of a greater being than that, than which nothing greater can be conceived, then our initial definition of God is flawed. Therefore, to avoid this contradiction, God must exist not only in our understanding, but also in reality. This argument, though incredibly controversial and debated ever since, shows Anselm's commitment to rigorous logical deduction from first principles. Another significant contribution from Anselm is his satisfaction theory of atonement, found in his work Cur Deus Homo, Why God Became Man. This book tackled the question of why God needed to become human and suffer death to redeem humanity from sin. Anselm argued that human sin was an offense against an infinite God, and therefore required an infinite satisfaction or reparation. Humans, being finite, could not provide this infinite satisfaction on their own. Only God, being infinite, could make sufficient satisfaction. But to pay the debt for humanity, this infinite satisfaction also needed to be offered by a human. Thus, God had to become human in Jesus Christ to make infinite satisfaction for human sin, restoring the honor of God and justly redeeming humanity. This theory became highly influential in Western Christian theology. Anselm's method involved methodical, step-by-step, logical reasoning starting from basic definitions or commonly accepted truths and moving towards profound conclusions. He sought to demonstrate theological truths with a kind of logical necessity, as if they were mathematical proofs. He believed that if you truly understood a concept, its truth would become apparent through reason. His influence on the development of scholasticism was immense. He set the precedent for using rigorous philosophical and logical methods to explore theological questions. His emphasis on faith-seeking understanding became the guiding principle for generations of scholars who followed, encouraging them to apply the tools of reason to the mysteries of Christian belief. The ontological argument, despite its critics and defenders, remains one of the most famous and continually discussed arguments in the history of philosophy, demonstrating the enduring power of Anselm's intellectual legacy. He showed that even the most profound truths could be approached with clear, incisive reasoning, proving that logical inquiry could indeed define an era.